And one of the things that really surprised me about this book was the definition of power. Because I was kind of struggling with the power and influence, but then he talks about power as the ability to impose consequences. And that was a very different way of thinking and talking about power that I don't think applies to influence. So I wanted to explore that a little bit, especially because folks in customer experience talk so often about, I don't have formal authority, I can't impose consequences, I don't have power, but we think we still have influence. All right, before we get to that though, Martha, we think your mic is back. Nope. I'm sorry. All right, we will come back to you. Gotta love technology has power over all of us, and that's not changing in any way. So let's just accept that. But this concept of power is the ability to impose consequences. Thoughts about that and kind of how it plays out in the business world? Zafar, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. This is my second meeting with you guys. I missed making numbers count. Okay, the most interesting thing about this book for me was that this book brought some intuitive knowledge to conscious level. You know, sometimes when you get angry very quickly and then you realize you're hungry, right? Sometimes you intuitively knew that you were hungry, but something made it conscious level. I'm hungry. That's why I get angry so quickly. So for me, kind of the book argues that the more powerful a person becomes, the more diminished moral sentiments he will have, and he will be prone to, you know, exceptionalism, and he starts to think that he is above others. And then, like, this knowledge is quite interesting for me. And then I realized why so many powerful people don't help poor. I mean, for example, people always say, this guy has so much money, so many, you know, influence. Why doesn't he want to change, or why doesn't he want to help others? Because they don't consider other people's problems as important. They consider it very trivial. I think that's the one example how power diminishes their moral duty. The more powerful they become, the more trivial people's problems seem to them.
Yeah.
I mean,
and by definition of having power, they get to decide what is and is not important, which others may not agree with. That's a fabulous point, Zafar, and welcome back. Liz, and then Carolyn.
So in a customer experience context, this has got me, your question is great. It's got me thinking of a number of different things. One is the power the customer does or doesn't have, right? And for context for folks, I work almost exclusively in healthcare in various different aspects of it, in the provider space, the payer space. I've worked in the life sciences space, where the customer in many ways has very little power, because if it's insurance, it's generally you get it through your employer, you don't have a lot of choice. If it's a provider, you need the care whether you need it or not. Same thing with a medication or a medical device. And so the ability of the customer to wield their power is fairly minimal, and that frustrates me. And then the other side of it is, perhaps because of that dynamic, I get very frustrated when customer experience is really a manipulation for how do we sell more, you know, push more, get our way, get them to stop using our expensive channels, et cetera, which happens a lot in healthcare, perhaps because the customer doesn't have power. And some of that is my own, you know, moralizing, like I'm much more driven by it's the right thing to do. Let's support the customer, whatever is in our power to do. And that's not, and I bump into an attitude that is much more whatever we can get away with. And I think that is a misuse of power, but a power that the non-market that exists in healthcare confers to the organization versus the customer. So
Yeah.
just, that's what you've made me think of.
Liz, that was actually, I don't know if you looked at them or not, but that was actually my first discussion question in the discussion question thread is everybody says customers have more power than ever. Really? Well, then why do they keep discontinuing my favorite line of concealer and I can't get the same thing? You know, I have money, I'll send my money elsewhere. They don't seem to care. So I think that's a valid question, even in markets where people do have choice. Carolyn, you've been waiting very patiently. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. And thanks for the club. This is my first time joining. My thinking in terms of influence versus power from an employer's perspective, and as it relates to the book, I also had some difficulty in terms of kind of like thinking through like the greater good. So people who are concerned with the greater good, tend to, according to the author, tend to accumulate power. I think that may or may not be true, and depending on the context. Within the employee-employer context, I have seen that from an influence perspective. So I've seen where someone who's being a jerk and just doesn't really care about their fellow employees or the organization, they are rooted out. Sometimes it takes longer than other times, but the general consensus is, if you're being a jerk to people, you're not going to last long for most organizations. I think that, though, is influence. So if you are caring about your fellow employees, you're contributing to group projects, you're a good collaborator and so forth, that tends to, I think, be extended toward influence versus the power dynamic is more from a manager, like especially from a senior manager perspective, like kind of pushing down on the organization or managing up, as the case may be, but really having that consequence as a manager and being able to force change as opposed to just influence, which is to me more of a employee or even maybe a mid-level manager type of role. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I do think, Carolyn, there's a specific example that's a little bit different from that, which is the brilliant jerk. If you've ever worked in any sort of tech company, right, you always have, you're not always, but you very often have the brilliant jerk who has the ability to impose the consequences of not having their talent and knowledge. And so that person doesn't get driven out because the consequence of them leaving would be too significant. But hopefully those are few and far between. Jeff, go ahead.
One of the things I was wondering about reading the book is the relation of empathy fatigue. As you gain more, get more stakeholders, more needs, and more people you just have to empathize with across the board. How does that also play into it too? Gosh, I can't make everybody happy, and as people, we start to shut down a little bit too of those emotional reactions. Even just reading the news, like, there are times where I'm like, I feel like I'm a pretty empathetic person, but there's some days where I'm like, I'm unsettlingly numb to some things happening in the world. Like,
yeah, Jeff, there's an interesting concept around that we have a psychological immune system in addition to having a sort of biological immune system. And so there's a phenomenon called the urban trance, which is when we're in highly densely populated environments, we do kind of tune out the people around us, because if we were that in tune to the emotions of all of the people around us walking down a street in New York City, our brains would collapse and we wouldn't be able to function.
Right.
So that there is something to that. And I think that's part of what as you rise in status, you influence more people, and so you have to, you get distant from them. But I think that's a really, really good point, that the more people you have the ability to impose consequences over, the more distant you feel from those people. Jumar.
I was also thinking of it from the generational shift in the workplace and everywhere, and how power and the concept of it is evolving. I mean, I was trying to interpret the book from my context, because I work for a provincial bank, for context. So literally my team is across, I do have the boomers in my team, fewer, but they're there. And then I have the Xers and the millennials, and actually, believe me or not, a recent Gen Z. And I feel when I'm talking to my team, because of the horizontal nature of working in CX in a bank across wealth and business, I personally feel the expectation from a leader is so varied, which got me linking this to the power paradox. If you think about it, and I do not want to make it stereotypical, but boomers do have a power construct in their mind, which is passed in a little bit of I'm not okay with this, but I'll live with it because that is the social construct. Versus when I compare it to the Gen Zers, and I don't know why I do all this research in my mind about my team. You know what? I will co-create with you. I'll build the operating plan with you, and I want to have a say. And I want, this is my well-being in my personal life. What you're doing to me at work is bringing it, So I just find that fascinating. And I was just reading this book and trying to bring it back to the reality of evolution of mindset. And I can tell you how my son perceives even the relationship with me. He told me the other day, you tell me you have experience, but I'm your first child. Do you have experience with parenting? Do you know, so I mean, he's 11. I'm you know what? I have experience with growing up. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. And that is, and in the book, they talk about parents. And so, yeah, it just got me thinking, just a point of, is the construct really evolving?
Well, that's a really, I think, insightful point for a couple of reasons. We talked about the concept, and is it really true that power is something that is given or inferred? And in some ways, I think of the Eleanor Roosevelt quote, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Usually if someone says something and you know for a fact it's not true, you're like, that's not true. Might be a slightly different gesture. But if it's something that you're inherently, insecure about, it will hit you. If the Gen Zers don't give people in formal authority the ability to have power over them, if they don't fear the consequences to their detriment, perhaps as they get older, then yeah, you do have less power over them. So that's a great example. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if it answers the question, but at the beginning you asked what struck you about the book. And so for me, the first thing was that there is a power paradox, that one exists. That I think was really, really striking. The higher up you go, the less empathetic and so forth. And there's a line in the book just at the beginning, it just says, handling the power paradox depends on finding a balance between the gratification of your own desires and the focus on other people. So I took that seesaw mentality with me as I went on through the book. What's good for me, what's good for other people. And then this also struck me, which again, I can see, I also had challenges, and I hear other people with challenges, is that apparently if you're remember the dorm room or the college dorm study, which he had 5 behaviors or characteristics: enthusiasm, kindness. Remember that part? And he said that if you're bringing these to the table, the group is going to hand you more power. And I thought, that's pretty remarkable. And my favorite example was the Lord of the Flies one, because in the Lord of the Flies, right, that it's, I think Piggy gets killed, right? As I recall, I haven't read it in a long time. But the way the author restated that book is actually in real life, that is not what would have happened. If the good side, quote unquote, would have carried forth and not the bad side. So this is what I took from the book. Now, again, the studies and so forth, are they too Western? Are they too privileged? Whatever, I don't know. And he does make fair points that he's got, a variety of different studies and so forth. But what I really took is there is a paradox, a power paradox out there. Be careful. Be careful. I took it more for myself than observing other people, if that makes sense. So that's all I had. Yeah.
No, it does, Daniel, and thank you for saying that. I think the perspective from which this idea can be applied is part of what makes it so intriguing. Martha, you're back. Let's try this again.
I think my audio works.
Yay! Yes, it does.
Okay, great. And I've been kind of in and out because of my little mic problem, so I hope I'm not repeating something that somebody said, but what struck me that's important in our everyday lives and in our customer experience roles is the banality of evil. And so he does quote Hannah Arendt appropriately, because no one's done more careful, critical thinking about power, I believe, in this past century than Hannah Arendt. But he doesn't go far enough on that. And I think, and she was the one who used that phrase, the banality of evil. And I think the power, we know from World War II, we know from Nazi Germany, we know that everybody, nearly everybody, is capable of incredibly evil constructs of power. And it's the saddest thing to know about we human beings. And no one really escaped. I mean, it's like 1 in 1,000 were kind and did the right thing, but most people did not. And I bring this up because I think so often what I've seen in corporations is Lord of the Flies really did play out. It wasn't the kind guy. It was the grabber. It was the alpha gorilla who won. And I just think that I think he had many of his studies seemed quite rose-colored glasses. These natural experiments, I kept finding holes in them. And so I kind of wasn't a fan, because I didn't think he was giving enough due to how easily and often and unfortunately power is misconstrued, and how dangerous that is. And you can read that into our political landscape, and it just into our corporations. I don't think it's the kind people who always win out. So
Yeah, and it's a little,
not to be negative, but
no, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because if Machiavelli goes back 500 years, and I would argue it even predates Machiavelli, if that had never happened and human societies weren't influenced by that, or our societies, would the scenario that the author describes be sort of the natural thing that happens? And I don't know, because I don't know. Liz, you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
No, I thumbs up the.
Oh, you thumbs up. Sorry. That was my hand gesture recognition.
Sorry, I will refrain.
No, don't. That's okay. So let's talk a little bit tactical, because this is one of those topics that we can wax philosophical, but the other reality of why I chose this book is I don't have any authority. I can't impose consequences. I hear that over and over again from customer experience leaders, and it may be true, but I think this challenges the idea that just because you can't impose formal consequences, you don't have the ability to influence people, or that by identifying the power dynamics in your organization, you can kind of lean into them. I posted last week's Word Nerd Wednesday, I posted about the concept of the power core from Jean Bliss's Chief Customer Officer book, which is kind of looking at your organization and going, what's the group that kind of sets the agenda, whether it's official or not? Like in a SaaS company, it's very often a product power core. The product is the company. In B2C companies, sometimes it's a marketing power core. Everything is about the campaigns and the acquisition and all of that, and the product is just kind of there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the power dynamics in an organization, how you adapt your strategies for influencing them based on kind of the power dynamics that you've picked up on, and anything people have seen through that. Liz, now you do have your hand raised.
Yes, I do. So I think one of the things as I was looking at this book and trying to apply it in a business context is this definition of what is the greater good. And in most capitalist companies, the greater good is finances. And there may be some other values that are espoused, but even when I've worked with not-for-profits, no margin, no mission, which I've only had one CEO say is a total cop-out. I think when we define that, if we define the greater good, and this isn't totally answering your question, but if we define the greater good as producing financial results, perhaps regardless of how you get there, then of course we see the kinds of power dynamics and misuse of powers within organizations that we see. And that's I think where I struggle, where I love the idea of the organizations that have that are for profit, but have a strong, I forget the letter acronyms that go with it, the 501, whatever it is. The B corporations.
B Corps. Yeah.
B corporations that have that stated as just as important. I don't know how well they all live up to it, but I think thinking from a customer experience perspective, I think where I've seen a lot of customer experience leaders struggle is to keep that idea of customer experience, not as a means to an end, but as a value in and of itself up in that higher level. Is how successful are they either at telling the stories that allow that customer experience to feel as important up there and not get, or to align it to an ROI in a way that says this meets this other value that we've said is the greater good. So that I think that's where I saw the connection here in this book.
Yeah, I think that's a great connection. And HubSpot puts it a little bit differently. They say bankrupt companies can't delight their customers. So that's from their culture deck. But yeah, there is sort of this inherent power exists because of what people do and do not value. An interesting thing that I'd love to hear people's thoughts on. So in 2016, I helped co-found the Boston chapter of Conscious Capitalism, which is an organization that is all about this. And one of the things that I learned in that process was that next generation investors, more to your point, people were inheriting their parents' and grandparents' investment portfolios and suddenly going, I don't want to be invested in some of these areas. And so the investor, and these are people with probably more money than I'll ever see in my lifetime, but they had the power to say, I want to know this about these companies, which led to the rise of the ESG movement. And it was only because the investors who had large sums of money to give or withhold started making decisions based on environmental consciousness, environmental sustainability. And I proposed to the CXPA board when we were in Denver a couple of weeks ago, is that a model that we should think about trying to mimic in customer experience? That it is something that matters on a little bit of a moral level, but until and unless the people who control the big money make it an issue, are we kind of throwing pebbles into an ocean? Sorry, that was my own little soapbox. Jamor.
I relate to that soapbox because I mean, my client is few of my clients, like, as I said, it's very horizontal, are the sales leaders who have that authority. Like, I've had questions like, in our capital market space, you're telling me about my clients, I talk to them every day. What possibly can you help me understand about my clients. Like, I know those 400 clients outside in, inside out. Like, I literally, like, so, so one thing, and it's been a journey. I mean, we are getting there, but I'm just like throwing it, like, the concept in this book about power with influence and, like, hierarchy. In their mind, they have a KPI of success defined. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but when you're putting the thing of CX on top of that, without them, in their mind, they're not understanding. You have this beautiful plan and you feel that it solves the world's problem and you see the end of it. That's why you believe in it and you have seen the impact of it, right? So I'm just what I face is when we like, you have to think of power from our end, right? When you are going and presenting that, you have a certain amount of power over their thinking because you're giving them this framework and saying you're not doing it. By doing it, you'll get better. In their mind, their walls are up, right? Because it's not aligning with their definition of power. So it's not that you don't have power at that moment presenting in front of the C-suite. You have a power over them, and the reason their walls are up is they are thinking now they are changing up my power dynamic. I was just trying to make connections with real life. So is the power coming from influencing, or before that, seeking that advocate? Like, that's literally our survival strategy, is who is our advocate in this hostile team, kind of find it. So is it a matter of that influence beforehand, which will give us power of influence? So that's where I'm coming from, because the reactions come because we are in a power telling them and the walls are up.
Yeah.
So
That topic actually came up in the very first book we read when I rebooted this, called The Catalyst. And it talked about the fact that people will resist doing something simply because somebody else suggests they could do it, because it threatens their autonomy. So our real power comes in the ability to make them think it was their idea, right? We have power if we know how to not manipulate them, but influence them in a way that leverages the reality of how we know people work. Stephanie, go ahead.
I mean,
Searching
yes,
for the mute
and
button.
yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a yes, and if we think about our role being so cross-functional, everybody we interact with can feel as if we're getting into their space, getting into their business, trying to tell them what to do. And it makes listening one of the biggest elements we have from a power perspective. If you think about those conversations where somebody says, I don't agree with you, the sales team, right? Yeah, you talk to the 100 most important people in those organizations, but our customer service people are over here dealing with all the people who work for them and are saying it's not great. Do we listen? Are we really understanding why that customer service person is saying, I can't do that way? And making sure that we're, whether it's lean, sitting down and watching somebody do their job, or really listening to the customer and helping other people understand what the customer is going through when they get this terrible communication from us that we don't want to change because it says all the stuff that we want to say. But that listening piece and helping make sure that we speak the language of the finance team or the sales team, it makes our jobs really, really tough.
It does. And Stephanie, you just prompted something in my mind, which is, if we talk about power as the ability to impose consequences, how often are those consequences unintended or unrealized? Right? So you have people who have the power to impose consequences by virtue of their position, but they're not aware of or thinking about the consequences that they're creating. If I make that technology decision, then people can't do this. If I make this decision, then people can't do this. I hadn't thought about that until just this second, but I think that's a really interesting avenue to explore.
Well, I love those collaborative journey mapping sessions where you really get everybody together and then you can start to see the light bulbs go off. And, they go, oh, when I do this, that's actually causing this other problem for you downstream. Yeah, but we have the tools to do it, but it ends up taking a lot longer than a lot of people would like it to.
Yeah.
More
And to
powerful
what
thought.
extent do people care? That's a very real question.
Mm.
I'm having conversations with one client right now where we have clearly established that there's a problem, but the executive team doesn't think it's a problem worth solving. And so our continued repetition of this is a problem, I'm like, stop, because they acknowledge that it's a problem. They have just decided that it's not a problem worth solving for them.
Can you
Okay,
explain
then what do
more?
you do?
Why? Why is it not a problem worth solving?
Strategy shift.
Huh.
Strategy shift. So if you're thinking about, we have this issue of the experience with a group of customers that we are pivoting away from. Is it worth it to fix their experience versus to invest in the experience for the new group of customers that we're going to target? Something like that. It also comes up in opportunity costs where it's like, okay, I can only do certain things. And if I have the potential to use that money to launch a new product where I can very clearly and concretely and through my own personal experience, see how that's going to make money come in the door versus spending money on this other thing that is less direct. And I believe on some level will probably help financially, but isn't as concrete, right? People like concrete things. That's another place where it's slightly different than it's not a problem worth solving, but it's an opportunity cost decision. And Liz, you wanted to weigh in on healthcare. Yes, we can't legally or ethically pivot away from any customers. Yes. But we do anyway.
Yeah, no, I think we do. We end up by default sort of doing it either by deciding we're going to design for the mainstream. Although increasingly in healthcare, we're getting pressure around health equity, at least in the US. And I know in Canada, that's been there's even more advancement in that direction, but just, yeah, it was an aside. We don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's interesting when you can't openly pivot away from any set of customers, and yet you end up underserving certain members of the base anyway, until and unless it becomes truly dangerous for those customers in a care arena, which it can.
Well, and Liz, you made me think about the concept of when organizations don't have power. I remember doing work with the IRS many, many years ago, and we always say you can't be all things to all people. And we kind of stopped ourselves and said, "Oh, wait, you're the one group that has to be all things to all people." And so, as an organization and with legislation or other things, are there certain things that even companies don't have control over? Regulated industries, financial services. That's a different level of power. Deb.
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of bridge back to the conversation about doing the jointly developed journey map. And I think there's two layers of empathy that gets built there. One, there's the empathy for the customer, and all different organizations are gaining it, and you see the aha moments go off. But I think by doing it cross-divisionally and with different organizations, there's also empathy for what are the barriers that the people have doing their job to try to serve the customers. So, and I think from that customer experience and trying to really influence others and exert the power, if you will, I think the empathy thing is legit. And I think that that's a chance to really understand, because then you can start to problem solve with somebody. Oh, now I understand how you have to approach this. How can, maybe you help them unlock something else that helps them as they see and empathize with the customer. What can they do to make a change, even in their environment? So it's a complex multi-layer empathy going on in that whole experiment.
Yeah, and I think we have the unique ability as people who are tasked with representing the voice of the customer, the voice of the employee. We have an opportunity to level some of that power playing field. I did a journey mapping workshop once where it was all employees in the room. There were no customers, but it was frontline employees, and they were terrified of actually saying how bad it was to management. So we had them in and we did the journey mapping all day. And it was, if anybody saw my Word Nerd Wednesday, it was a watermelon. Everything looked green on the outside. The customers were happy. The employees were getting crushed. They all left. And then the leadership came in and just looked at the journey map without any knowledge of who had put that together.
Mhm.
And they were horrified. They had no idea. But the sort of power dynamic had prevented that communication. And with this customer experience team, we were able to, I was a consultant, but we were able to level the power playing field, which felt really good. Stephanie, you had your hand up. Oh, no.
I was thinking that if we wanted to stay on track, maybe I shouldn't say what I wanted to say about the book. Deb, I love your point about empathy. And one of the places where the book lost me with the idea that as you are wealthier or more powerful, you completely lose your empathy. Is I know a lot of people who are neither wealthy nor powerful and are not terribly empathetic, and vice versa. So I really struggled with that piece. And empathy is something you can absolutely learn. It's something that we can help other people learn and see, and through the data, through the interviews, through the journey mapping, what's actually going on. So like,
yeah, and I think the relationship between empathy, power, and money, access to resources, you're right, it's much more complex than that. I know people who have nothing who are the most empathetic people in the world. I know people who have everything who are incredibly empathetic and generous. So there are a lot of factors that go into that, which is actually a great segue to what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to shift a little bit early this time, and perhaps you guys have already told me this. Our next book club, we're going to take the summer off. Our next book club is going to be in September. And I don't have a particular book or topic picked out yet. I have a couple that I'm reading that are candidates. But Kate and I were chatting earlier, and she said, well, why don't you ask the group? Are there books or topics that you guys would like to see us explore? There's going to be a meeting in September, another one in December. And then we're going to go pretty much quarterly, although at different points in the quarter, depending on how busy people usually are. Things you would like to see us explore in future meetings. Could be a book title, could be a topic. Empathy is, I just wrote empathy down. That's on the list. Sorry, I should have warned you I was going to ask this.
Well, Paul Bloom wrote a great book about why empathy is not. Paul Bloom is a professor emeritus at Yale, and he wrote a really interesting, very well-researched book about why empathy is not the solution, and it's kindness is what we want to focus on, especially in frontline environments, because if you have empathy in the frontline environment, you'll simply burn out. But there are other emotional skill sets that are more appropriate to call on. So that might be interesting. I'm always looking for well-researched. Was the research well done, and research that I can't immediately, obviously, poke a hole in.
Yeah, I try to do that very much. So I appreciate that suggestion as well. I will check out that book. I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, okay. It's about 5 years old.
Martha, I'm curious, does he distinguish the different types of empathy? Because there's affective empathy, there's different, does he look at that just out of curiosity?
Yeah, he does take a pretty deep dive into it and comes up with, yeah, it's not the best, it's not the most effective approach. So,
Yeah. Well, and when we look at it from a customer experience perspective, one of the ahas I had a couple of years ago was that telling employees to care more, caring is very often not the problem. The way I ended up saying it was that scale, complexity creates problems that empathy can't solve. The problem is not that people don't care. The problem is that caring people are within a system that is so complex that the right hand doesn't even know that the left hand exists, let alone what it's doing. And that requires a different set of solutions. So empathy is not the right thing does pique my interest, but I will never recommend a book I haven't read yet. So I'm going to have a very couple of long flights coming up. So I'm looking for some recommendations.
And I mean, not on the topic of empathy, but I'm reading
Okay.
because I do not like the narrative when people tell us CX and everything will change when AI will come into play, because that is the most overused statement of late. Because people say that without thinking through the consequences. So I've read a few books and didn't really land with me, but the most recent book, which I'm still reading, like Power and Prediction, what's resonating with me there, Megan, is they're trying to draw a parallel between, say, when electricity first came into existence, it was used as point solutions, right? And when it was used as point solutions, we had different types of roles. Like there was someone at an organization or at a big factory just switching on and off the electricity because it was a pretty big deal, because that person had a very responsible role. Because that's the point solution. And then the only time we saw electricity giving us the lift was when it changed the way we thought about life. And now, if electricity goes out and I don't have power backup, I can't function. So I'm just saying, that doom way we tell about, we speak about AI and how that's going to impact us. Is it really the case? Is it point solution? How many years away is it becomes a part of life? I found this book fascinating when it brought that lens into it versus seeing point solutions and getting too excited that tomorrow Gen AI is changing everything we are doing. It's an evolution from point solution to concept and way of living. So I really like that analogy where they don't speak of AI as a robot to change the world. They speak of AI of what it is, a way of living. So I'm just putting it out. I don't know the nature of books discussed here, but I would love to discuss it with people who do similar kind of work as me.
Well, AI is definitely a topic that we should probably read something about. I can be a little bit of a bury my head in this as an ostrich. Oh, this is hype, this is crap. I just won't talk about it. Maybe it'll go away. But it won't. And it would behoove us to educate ourselves. I also wrote down something else that I think is related to that you brought up early, which is generations. Would people be interested in reading a book? Deb, you just jumped up and pointed. So a book on generational. Okay. And those do kind of have to be recent because I've read a bunch, but I don't think Gen Z existed at the time that they were written. So we need to move on a little bit. And I will encourage people, if these are topics you're interested in, go hunt around. I'll ask for recommendations on LinkedIn, but you can email me, you can message me, you can put something in bookclubs.com. There's actually a suggested books and books I'd like to read. So you can put up notes there. But right now I have empathy, AI, and generational differences. I think between those three.
Yeah, I think there's plenty there. Something for maybe down the road is, do we need to cycle back to some of the classic CX books? Maybe once a year, hit something, sort of a new classic, if you will.
So Deb, I will tell you, I have intentionally chosen not to do CX books here, partly because I wanted complete impartiality. But I have been struggling because I know a lot of the people who wrote a lot of those books. The one book I have been struggling with is Fred Reichheld's new book on earned growth and the concept of earned growth as an evolution, kind of the next evolution. Again, that's another one that's on my list. I haven't read it, but the idea that the only way to run a long-term successful business is through earned growth. That's one. Has anybody read that one? No? Okay. That is another one that I've been thinking about, and it technically kind of is a CX book, but
yeah, and actually I do appreciate that approach. Just wonder if maybe once in a while, or maybe there's an offshoot that that there's some CX literature that we're exploring and discussing as well. But I actually really like the fact that you're going into the other concepts. And the three that you've got queued up here are all fabulous. They're really
All right,
great.
well, maybe I'll consider a separate book club. I just had visions of all of my friends calling me up and pitching, why haven't you done my book in my book club yet? And it's like, I might have to say, well, because I actually didn't think your book was that good, to a couple people. And that's not really a conversation I want to have. Few and far between, but I appreciate the input, and I will definitely think about that. Somebody just posted something in the chat, a link. Oh, this is the link to the book. Okay. All right. Well, we're at 2 minutes before the hour. So I am going to wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for embracing this topic. I was a little hesitant about this book because it does go into politics and society and stuff, but I thought the concept of power and the idea of a power paradox was important enough that it was worth talking about. So thank you for embracing that. And you will be getting information shortly about the September and December dates to mark on your calendar, and then plenty of time to listen to or read whatever book it is we decide to do next. So thanks, everybody. As usual, this was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for making this happen.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye, everybody.